bioscience. So he's not, in a sense, had much of a time to make his mark. When he first arrived, I remember him standing here talking about having a good hard look at pensions and welfare. A couple of weeks ago, he spoke at some length in a seminar, talked about the benefit system being crackers, wanted to tackle the problem of invalidity benefit. He's also got the massive problem of pensions to deal with. Work and pensions questions.
John Craig, sorry to interrupt you. We're just seeing live pictures of the Prime Minister Tony Blair getting into his vehicle there, heading obviously to Prime Minister's questions in the House of Commons. Been a difficult morning for him as well, perhaps, Adam?
Yes, the Prime Minister managing a smile, though, as he got in to his vehicle. It's now, because of security, this journey to the House of Commons is done in a different way each week. We never quite know which door or which vehicle the Prime Minister will be using. But I have to say, I am still intrigued by the account of David Blunkett's resignation that his official spokesman gave this morning, basically saying that the Prime Minister apparently told David Blunkett he was giving him his full support, i.e. suggesting to him that he could continue in office, and David Blunkett taking the decision that his position was untenable. It seems strange when so many people, as John Craig was saying, apparently joined by Lord Nolan as well, but Lord Mayhew, the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Alistair Graham, all people who are not the media, are not figures who have any access to grind, and who are figures of probity, said you've done something wrong and effectively you should do something about it. It seems odd that the Prime Minister apparently wants the public to feel that he didn't feel that way.
And therefore raising more questions about his prime ministerial skills, not only perhaps in just bringing David Blunkett back in the first place, but being prepared to hang on to him even today. I mean, one can only hypothesise, I suppose, if Blunkett had said, all right, then shall I go and keep working? Then Tony Blair will be facing very different questions in a few minutes.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I find puzzling about this account of the resignation, because, I'm sure there is massive sympathy for David Blunkett out there, but I suspect if we asked our viewers, and certainly from the comments I've been reading on our website and other people's websites, most people this morning will feel David Blunkett has done the right thing in resigning in the circumstances he's in. And yet for the Prime Minister to have his spokesman apparently saying, well, really I don't think he's done the right thing, but I've agreed with him in the circumstances, it seems an odd message to want to communicate, although clearly there must be an element of face saving in this, since as we've shown already on video this week, speaking out at the start of the week, the Prime Minister on the record and then through his spokesman in the subsequent days kept on saying the matter was closed. David Blunkett had tried to put things to amends and he could carry on doing his job.
Let's cross live now to Downing Street. We just saw the pictures of Tony Blair leaving Number 10 to go to the House of Commons. Jenny Percival is there and saw him go. And Jenny, he's facing a pretty tough Prime Minister's questions, isn't he?
The Prime Minister did manage half a smile, though, and it's going to be certainly a very, very difficult Prime Minister's questions. We already expected the Leader of the Opposition, Michael Howard, to raise the issue of David Blunkett. It doesn't make it any easier for him that he has now resigned, not least the explanation, as Adam was saying, it's a curious explanation from Number 10 about what actually happened. It appeared when we saw events unfold initially, and from what David Blunkett was saying the previous day, that he intended to stay in his post. He was defiant. He wasn't going to be hounded out by the media, he told his local newspaper. And then today Number 10 have told us that in fact it was David Blunkett who decided his position was untenable, and Number 10 reluctantly decided to accept his resignation. It won't make it any easier for Mr. Blair that he appears himself to be saddened, and he has obviously lost someone who is a Blairite, someone who's committed to the kind of modernising reforms that the Prime Minister wants to see. And he's also values David Blunkett as someone who can reach the kind of voters that other members of the Cabinet can't. He's come from a traditional working class background. As a disabled man, he's struggled in all sorts of ways to fulfil his job. He's had to do better than other people in order to secure his job, and he's a person, he's a charismatic individual, and he's someone that Mr Blair himself will very much miss from his cabinet.
And Jenny, we do understand that the Prime Minister's spokesman has said that he expects a replacement for Mr Blunkett as Work and Pensions Secretary to be announced later today. And this is a key job, isn't it, as far as Tony Blair's concerned?
There's a massive workload in Mr Blunkett's department. That's one reason that they do have to replace him very, very quickly indeed. Later this month, the Dare Turner's review on pensions is due out, and there's some very tricky questions to answer, including whether everyone should be forced to make compulsory payments towards their pensions. Also on the issue of incapacity benefit, the benefit that goes to those people who have disabilities or other problems which make it difficult for them to work. The government would like to clamp down on this and encourage some of those people to go back to work much sooner than they would like to do so. Those sort of issues are big, sensitive issues that require someone with a safe pair of hands, who's a strong player, who's a strong member of the cabinet. It'd be difficult to bring somebody in who's inexperienced. Names such as Alan Johnson have been mentioned. He came from that department and he's now Trade and Industry Secretary. John Hutton, the Cabinet Office Secretary, has also been mentioned, another existing member of the cabinet who's a very safe pair of hands. It's unlikely that people such as Stephen Byers or Alan Milburn would be brought back from outside the cabinet, but hopefully we will have an announcement on that later in the day.
Jenny, stay there for a moment. Adam, I just want to ask you, I'm rather intrigued by this idea of what David Blunkett will do next. And we've heard a lot this morning from various contributors who know him well, who talk about his toughness, and they also talk about him being very emotional. Is that a fiery combination? Could we see David Blunkett becoming something of a loose cannon, talking about his experiences in government in a less than discreet way?
I don't think he would betray Tony Blair. I think he's a true believer. He's a personal friend. I don't think in that sense he poses the sort of dangers that Claire Short posed, or perhaps even Robin Cook, although his objections were voiced in a very principled way. And as we've seen, he can't even blame Tony Blair for his sacking, because according to the Downing Street account, it wasn't a sacking, it was a voluntary resignation. Now, of course, David Blunkett continues to be an MP. He continues to have many friends, particularly in business, particularly from his time as Home Secretary. What I was suggesting was that in the fullness of time, and you know, at a human level, one certainly would not advise David Blunkett to rush into this. There will be people who will want to use his skills, whether it's in business or whether it's in a non-governmental organisation. But as a lifelong politician, effectively, I think he does have to accept that other than being an MP, that is probably now over for him.
So it's 2 strikes and you're out, is it?
I think it almost certainly is. I mean, I see it as impossible for Tony Blair in the limited time he's got to bring back David Blunkett. And then the question comes, well, would his successor, would Gordon Brown want to go out of the way to bring back David Blunkett, who's been a very open, both public and private critic of the Chancellor? If it is indeed Gordon Brown takes over the party, I think that's unlikely. So I think at his age, this is the bitterest one. This is, you know, this is the exit. But I'm quite sure David Blunkett's friends will rally round, and I'm quite sure in another sphere he will have something to offer.
Let's bring in Paul Goodman, shall we? He's the Work and Pensions Minister for the Tories, or the Shadow, I should say. Mr. Goodman, do you take much delight in this news?
I don't take any delight in it at all. I mean, David Blunkett has been, even though we disagree with him completely, a very considerable public servant, but the facts are pretty clear. I'm afraid he had to go because he was in clear and flagrant breach of the ministerial code. And I suspect when the history books of this are all written, what will be written is that his departure as a senior ally of Tony Blair was, I'm afraid, the beginning of the end for the Blair government.
His transgression, which he admitted and apologised for, when the history books are written, will not be seen as that significant, will it?
I wonder. I think it's a very, very serious business. If you're a minister, you're leaving office and you don't abide by the code. I mean, no less a person this morning than Lord Nolan, who was the man brought in years ago to clean everything up, so to speak, said this morning that his view was that this was pretty serious, and I think that Lord Nolan's verdict will be the verdict of history, I'm afraid.
Well, yeah, he said he should be disciplined, didn't he? He agreed with that. It didn't necessarily have to come to resignation. I'm wondering, can the Tories be, I suppose, congratulated, if you want to put it on the one hand, or perhaps criticised for making hay on this particular issue?
Whatever we do, we're always going to be congratulated by some people and criticised by others. But I think the plain fact of the matter is this: we're the opposition. We have to do our job and hold the government to account. And I personally took no pleasure at all whatsoever in pursuing David Blunkett over this matter. But I'm afraid it had to be done, and there were questions to be asked about the code. There were also questions to be asked about the firm with which he was involved with and its contacts with the Child Support Agency.
We asked Chris Grayling on this very matter as to whether or not he was trying to get Mr Blunkett out of office, and he didn't deny it.
Yes, so exactly. Yes, holding the government to account is what we have to do. If that means that a minister has to leave, so be it. I think it's significant, and I've spoken to Chris about this, that we're not calling for an inquiry now. David Blunkett's gone, that's the end of the matter, and when the history books are written, he certainly will be seen as very seriously at fault, but I think there's also a space to remember some of the contribution that he's made to public life too.
Paul Goodman, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
So more political reaction now. Alex Salmond, SNP leader, joins us also from Westminster. What do you think?
Well, I'm personally sorry for David Blunkett. I mean, I thought this was a borderline issue. I mean, clearly he broke the rules. On the other hand, I'm not certain it was in itself a resignation issue. See, I think the question is not so much the judgment of David Blunkett. I think the question is the judgment of the Prime Minister. I mean, he brought David Blunkett back into office far, far too soon. And now when the heat was on, he's pulled the rug from under his friend's feet. And, you know, today is the end for David Blunkett. It might be the beginning of the end for Mr Blair.
Why did you think it was a borderline issue?
Well, it was a question of interpretation and procedure. Now, David Blunkett's never asked for any special favours because of his disability, but I'm at least prepared to give a bit of latitude to say that not actually seeing a document yourself, having it read to you presumably, I think there's an area of latitude there. I mean, clearly he broke the rules. But whether it was a resignation matter in itself, I'm not convinced. But nonetheless, what I'm convinced about is we've got a Prime Minister who brings somebody back into office far too soon, and then when the heat goes on, when he's facing a tough Prime Minister's questions, when he's under fire, he clearly pulls the rug from under his pal's feet. And, you know, I think if Mr Blair carries on like that, he's not going to have many friends left. And I think the real issue is the judgment of the Prime Minister, not the judgment of David Blunkett.
So you think his blindness could have allowed him to think that letting the Independent Advisory Committee know was an entirely voluntary event, do you? Is that what you really believe? Because everybody else we've spoken to seems to think that the rules are very, very clear.
Well, yes, and I'm just saying there's an element of latitude there. I clearly broke the rules. The question is whether that in itself is a resignation matter. Now, he has resigned, but he's resigned basically because the Prime Minister has effectively withdrawn his support. Now, my interest is the judgment of a Prime Minister who brings somebody back into office after suffering severe trauma 6 months beforehand, brings them immediately back into office, sends them in to do a tough job, and then when he's under fire, effectively sacks him. Now, that's the behaviour we should be looking at, and that's the judgment we should be calling into question. And I think there's very severe questions to be asked about 10 Downing Street as opposed to the former Work and Pensions Secretary. I mean, one thing I would say that, the only pleasure I take from this is the fact that hopefully a new Work and Pensions Secretary will re-look at the idea of a citizen's pension, which would actually do something to help the millions of women who are not entitled to a state pension. David Blunkett wrongly, in my view, had ruled that out. Hopefully a new minister might rule it back in again.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see. When you, I think, entered Parliament at the same time as he did. Is that right, 1987?
Yes, that's correct.
What does it mean to someone who's held high office, and I know you've been in and out of it with the SNP, what does it mean to someone who's given their life to politics to find that you're going to sit on the back benches for the rest of your days?
Well, I was out of it and back in it again. I think for David Blunkett, who clearly relished the experience of being a minister and had no wish clearly to resign. My question is, basically, he came back into office far too soon. I don't think even his worst enemy would argue that he was not a significant political force. But there has to be a huge question mark about taking somebody back into government 6 months after the media and personal trauma that David Blunkett went through towards the end of last year. And that's the real question mark. Why was he brought back so soon? I mean, what sort of judgment does that indicate from the Prime Minister? And then I think it's a bit distasteful under all these circumstances of a Prime Minister effectively pulling the rug from somebody who, by his almost attendance at the Work and Pensions Committee today, clearly intended himself to tough it out. Well, you can't tough it out if the Prime Minister has decided enough is enough.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was going to say that surely a general election is almost like a clean sheet. You can start again, bring back who you like, can't you? It's like a fresh start.
Well, a Prime Minister can do effectively what he likes in terms of hiring and firing, but people are entitled to question his judgment. He brought back Peter Mandelson twice, or was it 3 times? He brought back Alan Milburn, they had to go again. I mean, there is if you lose 1, 2, now 3 ministers, under these circumstances, it's rather more than a misfortune. The Prime Minister looks accident prone, and I think I'm entitled, other people entitled, to question his judgment. And actually, I've got even more questions about the Prime Minister's judgment than I have about David Blunkett's.
Well, I'm sure you'll be able to put those questions to him, perhaps, if you get over to the House of Commons. We'll just look at the camera positions there, if you get called by Mr. Speaker, of course. Let's just see the pictures from inside the House where it's Peter Hain, I think, at the dispatch box at the moment. Now, I would imagine, Adam, attendance for this, which is normally pretty good, would be, it'll be full to bursting today, won't it?
Well, yes, so not just because of Prime Minister's questions, as you say, which is normal attendance, but there are 3-line whips running today, obviously on the committee stage of the terror bill. I mean, the government facing a very, very important issue today, and a potential backbench rebellion on the subject of the extension of detention. So I think there'll be an absolutely a packed house, and people will be fascinated to hear what the Prime Minister has got to say.
Now, because Mr. Blunkett's called a press conference for 12:30 at his old department, we would imagine he's probably not going to make it to the Commons and back. I may be proved wrong, but what would be your anticipation?
Well, it's possible to get between the two within about 5 minutes, even if you're walking. I think that would be a matter for David Blunkett. It would be possible for him to do it. I have to say I will be pretty astonished if this news conference starts on the dot at 12:30. Again, experience of these things at short notice is that they can slip quite a lot. So we may see David Blunkett, but at the moment he's not there on the front bench, and of course at the moment he is in limbo. Effectively, he's resigned as a minister, but he hasn't yet been replaced.
We can see, of course, a couple of senior cabinet ministers behind Jack Straw chatting to Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown looking very relaxed, and of course, immediately comes to mind all those comments that David Blunkett made to Stephen Pollard, the biographer. I mean, it'd be interesting to see the faces of those cabinet ministers when Tony Blair talks about David Blunkett's departure.
I mean, I genuinely think that there is probably no member of the cabinet who even for personal ambitious reasons, will be anything other than sorry at a personal level for what's happened to David Blunkett. It's been remarkable that he's had a lot of friends sticking by him, but at the same time I was talking to one of those close friends who's defended him publicly, who nonetheless was saying, asking me effectively how bad I thought it was, and not really disputing the interpretation or the version of events which I was giving. And certainly, a lot of MPs, these sort of issues, these pensions issues, these issues on invalidity benefit are things which really, really matter for them. They've got constituents who trouble them on them all the time. They're going to be asked to do difficult things on that. And if they felt, as some of them did, that he was a man who was tainted in some way in the area of his personal desire to accumulate wealth, then they didn't really have much patience with him. And it's interesting that if we trace the line on this, the Conservatives have always trod very carefully, saying that it's the issues of ministerial conduct that they were concerned with. They didn't ever gun directly for Mr. Blunkett. And in fact, the first people to use that expression, untenable, which David Blunkett apparently used about his own position this morning, first person was Peter Kilfoyle, a former Labour minister, still very much an influential Labour MP, and then we heard other people like MP for Norwich coming in yesterday. And so I think the element that should not be forgotten is that there was not a lot of support for David Blunkett staying on within the Labour Party, although of course there was always a great deal of personal sympathy for a man in his position.
We were talking to our colleague John Craig, weren't we, who's trying to plug into the rumours going around the Department of Work and Pensions. Two candidates, prospective candidates, or at least names to fill the shoes left by Mr. Blunkett, being David Miliband and John Hutton. Give us your take on those two gentlemen, Adam.
Well, they're both very much seen as rising men, if you like. John Hutton has clearly worked in this sort of area before. David Miliband is often said to be the greatest intellectual in the government, a man of enormous capacity. He, of course, was involved closely in running the general election campaign, and since then he's been moved in to work closely.
He's got the Christian name David, which always helps in modern politics.
Well, it might help at the moment. I honestly think, again, lessons from previous crises like this, that actually speculating on names until you get a very strong official steer can often be misguided. I mean, we've seen surprising names coming up, but clearly with people like Ruth Kelly,